The rise of an aggressive China under Xi Jinping has severely disrupted the post-Cold War international order. Xi aims for China to become the world's leading superpower by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's victory over the nationalists in China's civil war. To achieve these goals, China has used its economic leverage to seduce or coerce other nations and multinational corporations to go along with its bidding. It has also expanded its military presence in the South China Sea and increased its saber-rattling against Taiwan, which it aims to incorporate back into the mainland's governance by 2049. China's behavior has caused great alarm among its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region, prompting the response of a new multilateral coalition, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. But what is this organization, usually called the Quad? Why is it after China? And what are its intentions to counter China's behavior? The Quad had its beginnings in December 2004, in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. On the 29th, then-President George W. Bush announced that the United States would partner with a regional core group of India, Japan, and Australia to coordinate relief efforts. The effort gave the group its first experience of conducting maritime operations together. The Quad got renewed impetus in the initial rise of Shinzo Abe as the Japanese Prime Minister. When campaigning for office in 2006, Abe described his vision of an arc of freedom and prosperity. The arc would be a grouping of like-minded states in the region making a collective effort to promote liberal values like free markets and the rule of law. In December 2006, then Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh announced his country's accession to the dialogue. When 2007 began, then American Vice President Dick Cheney signaled American interest and convinced then Australian Prime Minister John Howard to cooperate as well. Abe travelled to India that April, which paved the way for the Quad's first senior-level meeting the following month. The navies of the four countries then cooperated in the second Exercise Malabar alongside the Singaporean Navy. Despite this promising start, the Quad experienced troubles shortly thereafter. China always viewed it as a threat. At that time, it was not yet apparent that China would attempt to change the international status quo by coercive methods. There were still great hopes that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization in the country. Important potential partner countries like South Korea were therefore reluctant to join the Quad and risk alienating China. Meanwhile, India, traditionally a non-aligned country, saw public protests over its participation in the Malabar exercise. China's diplomatic efforts helped to lead to the unraveling of the Quad and Shinzo Abe's fall from power in September 2007, depriving it of its leading advocate. By the beginning of 2008, the Quad had collapsed. A decade later, things had changed dramatically. China became more authoritarian at home and confrontational abroad under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who came to power in late 2012. At the same time, Shinzo Abe returned to power in Japan, and just one day after his second premiership began, he signaled his geopolitical intentions. Peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Pacific Ocean are inseparable from peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean. Japan, as one of the oldest seafaring democracies in Asia, should play a greater role, alongside Australia, India, and the US, in preserving the common good in both regions. This statement was the prototype of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific (FOIP) strategy. Abe's policy was to insert a reinvigorated Japanese military into traditional bilateral and trilateral exercises between the United States, India, and Australia. For example, the United States and India continued to do their traditional bilateral Malabar naval exercises, but Japan became a permanent party to these in 2015. As Abe worked to slowly reconstruct the Quad, China became more confrontational with all of its participating countries. Disputes ratcheted up between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands, which the former administers but the latter claims as its territory. India and China had numerous border standoffs. Australian politicians were found to have accepted money from China-aligned organizations and individuals, which helped to lead new foreign interference laws in that country in 2018. The rise of Donald Trump to the White House in 2016 also spurred the reformation of the Quad. Trump had long been of the belief that China was the greatest threat to the United States, which made him agreeable to the idea of the Quad. An October 2017 meeting between then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono resulted in them proposing a resumption of the full Quad. The following month at the ASEAN conference in Manila, representatives from the four countries met on the margins to discuss the tense situation in the Indo-Pacific region. All four affirmed their support for the FOIP concept. Quadrilateral meetings on the issue have continued ever since. In the 2000s, after its revival, China has often complained that the Quad is an attempt to create an Asian NATO to contain it. However, the Quad is not a formal alliance, unlike NATO. It's rather an informal grouping of countries. In a statement that laid out the spirit of the Quad, in 2021, the group's leaders said, "We bring diverse perspectives and are united in a shared vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. We strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion." While not declaring a formal alliance, the statement left little room for doubt that China was the main source of concern among the Quad's members. As such, the Quad is first and foremost a security cooperative, as its proper name suggests. Joint security cooperation has been an integral feature of the Quad since its refounding. Australia was added to the annual Malabar exercises in 2020 and has repeated its presence there since. Quad countries are also increasing their bilateral and trilateral security ties. Japan and India engage in regular JIMEX exercises in the North Arabian Sea, while India and Australia have their bilateral AUSINDEX exercise. All Quad countries are participants in the multilateral Rim of Pacific (RIMPAC) exercises. The United States, which is a long-time ally of both Japan and Australia, conducts regular military cross-training with both of those countries. Japan's goals for the Quad are relatively simple. Ensure that China does not become the hegemon of Asia. If such a thing were to happen, its trade would be imperiled. Roughly 40% of Japan's imports come through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, and as a resource-poor nation, it needs those imports for its economic survival. Unfortunately for Tokyo, China has increasingly militarized and monopolized the area since 2012. If China is not deterred from further aggression, Beijing will be in a position to dictate the trade of the region, forcing Japan into a terrible geopolitical position. If China gets too powerful, Japan may also lose control of the Senkaku Islands, just as the Philippines lost control of the Scarborough Shoal. The alliance with the United States has traditionally been, and remains, the foundation of Japan's national security. But Australia and India are valuable partners that it cannot do without in light of the higher stakes. Japan has therefore deepened its security ties with Australia. The two countries made a reciprocal forces agreement to formalize procedures for overseas troop deployments. In 2023, Japan announced it will be stationing troops in Australia, which is a deviation from decades of traditional military policy in Tokyo. Japan has also made an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement with India, along with defense equipment, technology, and intelligence sharing agreements. For Australia, the Quad is a reinforcement and leveling up of its traditional diplomatic relationships. For example, Australia has long been a partner in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance with the United States. Australia's military cooperation with Japan has increased, and in June 2020, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison signaled a mutual logistics sharing agreement with India, while announcing that their bilateral institutions would now be considered as a comprehensive strategic partnership. Moreover, China's recent security pact with the Solomon Islands, which sit to the northeast of Australia, threatens its trade. Australia needs a counterweight, which it sees the Quad as being. The Quad has also allowed Australia to become more militarily capable, as the AUKUS pact with the United States and the United Kingdom will give it nuclear submarines, which Beijing loudly complained about. For India, the Quad represents a departure from its traditional policy of strategic autonomy in foreign affairs. Unlike the other three Quad members, it does not have experience participating in America's system of military alliances. Still, India needs partners, if not allies, to prevent China from getting too powerful. India and China share a disputed border. China's navy has increased its presence in India's backyard. China is also an important partner for India's traditional enemy, Pakistan. China's economic partnerships with India's neighbors through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Comprehensive Economic Partnership threaten to isolate India from the region. In light of this reality, India has had little choice but to increase its ties with the United States. New Delhi has increased its security ties with Washington through military purchases that include anti-submarine platforms and heavy-lift aircraft. India has also signed logistics and base access agreements with Australia and Japan. For the United States, keeping China's power in check and preventing it from becoming a regional hegemon is now the top foreign policy priority. For Washington, the Quad is a valuable institution to assist America in achieving this goal. The United States has global commitments, which Russia's invasion of Ukraine made all too clear. In a direct confrontation between the United States and China, the latter would be able to concentrate all of its resources in the conflict, while America's forces would be divided. Washington has long sought to put a greater emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region, but despite this being a rare area of bipartisan consensus, it's never been able to do so to the extent that it has wanted. NATO's free rider problem and Middle Eastern flare-ups are only two examples of things which divide the attention of the United States and force it to spread its resources more thinly. The Quad therefore is a means for Washington to both put greater emphasis on the strategic region and build up forces and relationships to assist in containing Beijing's ambitions. Through the security cooperation of the Quad, the United States is steadily improving the military readiness of Japan, India, and Australia. The Quad also allows for the rapid cooperation of America's partners to threaten Chinese shipping. For example, India can easily threaten to choke Chinese shipping off from the Strait of Malacca, while Japan can do the same for the Strait of Miyako. As China relies heavily on foreign food and fuel imports, this is an important measure of geostrategic leverage to force China to change its behavior. America's Quad partners are strategically positioned to the east, west, and south of the First Island chain, multiplying the United States' ability to contain China's ambitions in the region. For these reasons, China was again quick to protest the Quad and denounce it as a method of containment, but the cooperating countries have cared far less about Beijing's protests in this second go of the security partnership. China's actions since the first incarnation of the Quad fell apart had alienated its neighbors in the region, as well as the United States. China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic only strengthened the conviction that China was a bad actor on the world stage. 2020 would be an important year in defining the Quad's purpose and giving it staying power. Shortly after the pandemic began, China got into a diplomatic row with Australia over the latter's insistence on an independent inquiry into its origins. China responded to these calls by imposing punitive tariffs on many Australian exports. Meanwhile, the border dispute between China and India saw an armed confrontation in June 2020, which resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian troops and 4 Chinese soldiers. The events of 2021 spurred the Quad to expand its purview. Despite the chaotic presidential election in the United States, Donald Trump's successor, Joe Biden, largely continued his administration's policies regarding China, including with the Quad. However, Biden soon signaled his intentions on expanding the Quad beyond a coalition to contain China. It was the first summit of Joe Biden's presidency, indicating the importance of this multilateral relationship to the new administration's foreign policy agenda. Under Joe Biden, the Quad has evolved beyond a purely military or security partnership. It has also been involved in economic and diplomatic aid. For example, the group's first summit, which took place in March 2021, outlined its plans to counter the COVID-19 pandemic by distributing 1 billion doses of the single-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine to low- and middle-income countries in Southeast Asia by the end of 2022. The United States would finance the measure, Japan and India would manufacture the vaccines, and Australia would take the lead in distributing the shots and getting them into arms. It was the start of a broader purpose for the Quad, to tackle other global challenges such as cybercrimes, terrorism, and climate change. Although this would seem irrelevant as a strategic counter to China, it's not. China has sought to expand its influence through economic and diplomatic partnerships equally as much as it has attempted to with its military buildup. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of Xi Jinping's most important strategic initiatives, which is why it's not surprising that infrastructure has also been on the Quad's agenda. At the first in-person Quad summit in September 2021, the leaders announced that high-standards infrastructure would be a priority for the partnership. This announcement was an evolution of the trilateral infrastructure partnership already in place between the United States, Japan, and Australia. In May 2022, the Quad leaders announced the Quad Infrastructure Coordination Group, which would focus on transportation, digital connectivity, clean energy, and climate resilience. The statement released by the Biden White House said that the heads of the Quad's respective national development financing agencies had met in Tokyo to discuss the infrastructure financing gap in the region, a veiled shot at the Belt and Road Initiative. The announcement stated that these agencies would cooperate with each other and the private sector to support investments in critical infrastructure. The same White House press release also announced that space and emerging technologies would continue to be a focus for the Quad. The subjects range from 5G supplier diversification to space observation, satellite data sharing, and disaster response and relief for the Indo-Pacific region. In space, the Quad's focus is on observation and data exchanges for the moment, but the release also mentioned a focus on consulting on norms and guidelines. However, with China testing hypersonic glide vehicles, it seems likely that the Quad's security relationship will eventually expand to space. The Quad aims to foster ties between the people of respective member states as well. At their 2021 summit, the leaders announced the Quad Fellowship, which will sponsor 100 students per year, 25 from each country, to pursue STEM graduate degrees at elite universities in the United States, with the cooperation of the private sector. While the dialogue is currently limited to 4 members, there have been discussions about expanding the Quad. Quad Plus meetings have included South Korea, New Zealand, and even Vietnam. South Korea has expressed interest in joining the organization formally, although this has not happened yet. Why? While tensions between the two have lessened since the election of Yoon Suk-yeol to the South Korean presidency in 2022, Seoul and Tokyo have long had frosty relations over historical, economic, and security issues. There is no guarantee that the gradual thawing in relations between South Korea and Japan will continue. Therefore, the Biden administration seems worried that a renewed stress between the two would undermine the Quad's cohesion, should South Korea formally join it. It's also arguable that formally including other countries in the core Quad would undermine the group's cohesion. Too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. The current grouping allows rapid communication and decision-making among its members, and all 4 seem to want to keep it that way. On the other hand, the Quad cannot afford to remain too insular. Other like-minded countries, including countries in Europe, are expanding their Indo-Pacific strategies and their presence in the area. If the 4 Quad members do not engage in meaningful coordination with these efforts, they risk duplicating or undercutting each other's efforts in the region, according to a report written by Garima Mohan and Christy Govella for the German Marshall Fund, a security and democracy-focused think tank headquartered in Washington. Furthermore, to build a positive alternative to China's vision for the Indo-Pacific region that goes beyond the security sphere, the Quad will need to develop a reputation of delivering on its many pledges. Unfortunately for the Quad, there are already reasons to believe that it will not be able to do so. By May 2022, it was clear that the vaccine partnership had underperformed the lofty goals set for it. Delivery of the shots only began in early 2022, when the pandemic was already winding down. By May, the Quad had delivered less than half the vaccine doses it promised thanks to time, circumstances such as India's COVID-19 outbreak in the spring of 2021, and controversy over the selected Johnson & Johnson vaccine. By September 22, it became clear that the goal would not be met, and the Quad pivoted away from the vaccine pledge. Instead, the Quad's policy would shift to preparing for future emergencies, such as strengthening global healthcare architecture and prevention of future pandemics. The Quad has not always been smooth sailing in other ways too. The 4 members have been at odds at times. Unlike the other 3 Quad members, India has been far more ambiguous in its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's purchased Russian energy at an increased rate, helping to keep Moscow's economy afloat. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also come under international controversy for his government's crackdown on the country's Muslim population in the Indian-controlled portion of the disputed Kashmir region. As the Quad pledges to be a bulwark of liberal values, some of Modi's policies may undermine its humanitarian image. However, these controversies have tended to take secondary status in the Quad, which remains a security-first grouping. In international relations, security considerations will always take priority over economic and ideological considerations. And with the Quad now being broadly popular among the electorates of all 4 member states, it's an institution with staying power, unlike the way it was the first time round. For all 4 members of the Quad, the security considerations are clear. China under Xi Jinping has inserted itself at the center of many of the world's critical supply chains, built up its armed forces, saber-rattled against its neighbors, expanded its influence over other nations with its Belt and Road infrastructure projects, and become more authoritarian. Preventing China from becoming strong enough to dictate terms in the region is a matter of survival for India, Australia, and Japan, and necessary if the United States wishes to remain the world's leading nation. The Quad may not be an Asian NATO, but its arrival has made many experts conclude that there is a new Cold War going on in the Indo-Pacific region. As NATO proved so important in containing the Soviet Union in the first Cold War, the Quad's advocates seek for it to do the same to China now. But what do you think about the Quad? What will its future be, and how will it shape the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.